Welcome back. We're picking up where we left off. You know the ground we're covering today because you've been doing the reading and you understand the historical frameworks we've been building over the last two deep dives.
Right. This is our third and final installment in the progression through the back half of 2 Kings.
Yeah. So 2 sessions ago, we examined chapter 17 and the fall of the northern kingdom of Israel. And then last time, we navigated the reigns of Hezekiah and Manasseh, along with the Assyrian crisis under Sennacherib.
Which brings us to the conclusion of the narrative today. We're looking at Josiah's reform, the scroll discovered in the temple, his sudden death, and, well, the final collapse of Judah.
Which culminates in the burning of Jerusalem.
Right.
We're looking at chapters 22 through 25 today. And just to set our agenda for this deep dive, here is how we'll proceed. Step 1, we'll establish the narrative and historical setting, looking at the collapse of the Assyrian Empire and the brief window of Judean independence that made King Josiah's reign even possible.
It's a very specific geopolitical window.
Exactly. Then step 2, we'll transition into some scholarly framing. We'll analyze Josiah's reform, the finding of the scroll, and the foundational Dovet hypothesis.
Which is crucial for understanding the text itself.
Right. Step 3, we'll examine the theological rupture caused by Josiah's death at Megiddo and the subsequent Babylonian deportations that ended the kingdom.
The complete geopolitical freefall.
Yeah, precisely. Step 4, we'll engage in a scholarly synthesis, placing the opening chapters of the Book of Mormon precisely within this historical and religious matrix.
Because they overlap perfectly.
They do. And finally, step 5, we'll close by shifting from the academic analysis to a more faithful Latter-day Saint reflection on the covenant, concluding with a look at the enduring nature of the text.
I think we also need to explicitly bring in that element we've deferred until now. The years covered in these final chapters correspond exactly with the internal chronology of the opening of the Book of Mormon.
First Nephi begins the first year of Zedekiah's reign.
Right. And Zedekiah is the last king we're going to encounter in the biblical text today. So, we are no longer looking at texts separated by centuries. We're looking at the exact same city, the exact same decade, and the exact same political crisis.
It's the exact same world.
Yeah.
So let's begin with the geopolitical reality of the 620s BCE. We need to look at the atmosphere of the ancient Near East at this specific moment.
Yeah, for 3 centuries, Judah had existed under the shadow of the Assyrian Empire. Assyria essentially dictated the terms of survival.
They extracted heavy tribute, they directed foreign policy, they even imposed their own cultural and religious frameworks on their vassals.
But, empires have life cycles. By the late 7th century, that Assyrian war machine was really faltering.
Why was that? I mean, they had been dominant for so long.
Well, the structural integrity of the Assyrian Empire relied heavily on the sheer force of personality and the military competence of its monarch. The pivotal moment here is the death of Ashurbanipal.
He was the last really effective Assyrian king, right? Around 631 BCE.
Yeah, exactly. When he dies, the succession crisis is severe. You have a massive imperial structure that has expanded to its absolute logistical limits.
It just can't sustain its own weight.
No, it can't manage its restive vassals once central leadership falters. It's a really swift unraveling.
And when we talk about an empire unraveling in the ancient world, it's not a quiet bureaucratic process.
Oh, definitely not.
It means the tribute collectors stop showing up.
Yeah.
It means the imperial garrisons stationed in those vassal states are suddenly recalled to the capital to fight in civil wars.
The local kings who have been suffocating under these demands for generations suddenly look around and realize the overseers are just
Gone.
Yeah, they're gone. That is the exact reality. And Babylon, which had long been a subordinate but culturally significant city to the south, sees this weakness and rebels.
Right, they see their opening.
They do. They form an alliance with the Medes, which is a rising power to the east. This coalition marches on the Assyrian heartland. It's a coordinated, brutal campaign that culminates in 612 BCE when they sack Nineveh.
The Assyrian capital.
Yes. This is an event that sends shockwaves through the entire region. It's the specific event the biblical prophet Nahum documents and celebrates in his book.
Because the terror of the Near East had finally been brought down. The empire that had skinned its enemies alive and deported entire nations was just broken.
Exactly. The fall of Nineveh creates a specific geopolitical gap in the Levant. Assyria is retreating and dying, but Babylon hasn't yet fully consolidated its power over the Western territories.
So for a small kingdom like Judah, this gap means they can finally breathe. The pressure of foreign tribute vanishes. The foreign garrisons withdraw.
And it is in this exact narrow window of time that Josiah comes of age.
Right, because Josiah comes to the throne as an 8-year-old boy following the assassination of his father, Ammon.
And as he grows into adulthood, he finds himself governing a Judah that suddenly has room to maneuver.
For 4 generations, Judean kings had to calculate every single move based on the reaction of an Assyrian overlord.
But Josiah doesn't have to do that. And this is crucial. His religious reforms are inseparable from this political opening.
How so? Like the physical cleanup of the temple.
Right. Reclaiming the temple from Assyrian astral cults, which had been imposed or adopted as a sign of vassalage during the reigns of Manasseh and Ammon, that is a reclamation of Judahite national identity.
He's centralizing worship in Jerusalem and purging foreign influence. From the perspective of the people living through it, this must have felt like a permanent restoration of sovereignty.
It really would have. They are sweeping away the idolatries, purifying the temple, standing on their own. They're repairing the physical breaches in their most sacred architecture.
It's a moment of intense national self-assertion. The political independence and the religious purification are really 2 sides of the same coin here.
You cannot separate Josiah, the religious reformer, from Josiah, the independent monarch. It's a period of genuine optimism.
The borders of Judah are even expanding northward, right, into the territory of the old northern kingdom of Israel, which Assyria had previously controlled.
Yeah, Josiah is basically acting like a king of a united, sovereign Israel.
Yet, there is a profound historical irony here. We are reading this history knowing how it ends.
Right. We have the benefit of hindsight.
The characters in the narrative do not know that this high watermark of reform is sitting a mere 22 years before Jerusalem will burn.
They're experiencing this revival, operating under the assumption that their faithfulness is securing their future.
Entirely unaware that Egypt and Babylon are maneuvering into positions that will close this window forever.
Which brings us to the analytical questions raised by this era, specifically looking at the text of 2 Kings 22 and the mechanics of Josiah's reform.
Okay, let's pivot to that. The narrative records that in the 18th year of his reign, Josiah sends his secretary, Shaphan, to the temple.
Right. It's a completely mundane administrative errand to arrange payment for the workers conducting the repairs.
But during this process, the high priest, Hilkiah, informs Shaphan that he has found, quote, the book of the law in the house of the Lord.
Yes. Shaphan reads it, takes it to the king, and reads it aloud to him.
And Josiah's reaction is visceral. He tears his clothes in distress because the nation has failed to live by the requirements of this book.
Right.
But I want to pause here and look at this logically. How does the central religious text of a nation go completely missing in its own sanctuary?
It's a fair question.
I mean, how is it that its contents are a devastating surprise to both the monarch and the high priest? We're talking about the core operational manual for their religion, lost inside the building where the religion is actually practiced.
The narrative presents it strictly as a rediscovery of a lost antique text. However, the fact that its demands are entirely unfamiliar to the current leadership has driven a major line of scholarly inquiry for over 2 centuries.
This is the Devet hypothesis.
Exactly. In 1805, a scholar named Wilhelm Martin Leberek de Vet proposed a hypothesis in his doctoral dissertation that became foundational for modern biblical scholarship.
And what was his core argument?
He argued that the scroll found in the temple was some form of the book of Deuteronomy, or at least its central legal core.
Walk us through his reasoning on that. He didn't just guess this out of nowhere. He looked at the specific actions Josiah takes after reading the scroll and matched them to the text we currently have, right?
Correct. De Vet observed that Josiah's reforms matched the distinctive signature demands found in Deuteronomy, demands that are not emphasized in the same way, or even present, in the earlier laws of Exodus or Leviticus.
Like the centralization of sacrifice.
Yes, the primary demand of Deuteronomy is the centralization of all sacrifice at a single sanctuary, which in this historical context means Jerusalem.
Deuteronomy explicitly calls for the abolition of local shrines or high places, the destruction of sacred poles, and it dictates specific, centralized regulations for national festivals like the Passover.
Right. And when you read 2 Kings chapter 23, Josiah enforces these exact provisions step by step.
He shuts down the outlying altars, he brings the rural priests into Jerusalem, and he centralizes the cult.
The De Vet hypothesis essentially anchors the entire documentary hypothesis by providing a specific date, 622 BCE, and attaching it to a specific text.
It suggests that this version of Deuteronomy was a product of the 7th century, shaping the religious landscape of Josiah's time, rather than a seamlessly preserved text passed down unchanged from antiquity.
It gave scholars a fixed chronological point. Now, while the connection between the scroll and Deuteronomy is widely accepted across biblical scholarship, the origins of the scroll remain heavily debated.
What are the main theories? Was it a genuine, forgotten antique that had been lost during the syncretistic reigns of Manasseh and Amon?
That's one option. Another is that it was a pious fraud, a document recently generated by Hilkiah, Shaphan, and their scribal circle to authorize a centralizing political and religious agenda.
It's a significant question. I mean, the idea of a pious fraud suggests that the Jerusalem establishment wrote a new law code, claimed it was ancient, and used it to consolidate power, tax revenue, and religious authority right there in the capital.
Right, it's a very cynical view of the event. But there is also a middle ground, which is held by many scholars.
Which is what?
It acknowledges that ancient texts were routinely updated, edited, and applied to contemporary situations. Perhaps an older, existing northern legal tradition was brought to Jerusalem after the fall of Israel in 722 BCE.
Preserved by scribes and then updated.
Exactly. And its discovery was utilized by a reform movement that was already seeking to consolidate power in Jerusalem. Whatever the exact origin of the physical scroll, its discovery provided the authoritative, divine impetus for what we now call the Deuteronomistic reform.
This directly connects to the work of Frank Moore Cross and his two-edition model of the Deuteronomistic history, which we've discussed in prior sessions.
Yes. Cross proposed that the first edition of the history, extending from Deuteronomy through the books of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, was composed during Josiah's reign.
It was a program document.
Right.
When you say program document, you mean it was written with a specific political and theological agenda in mind, designed to justify Josiah's current actions by framing all of past history as leading up to him.
Exactly. This first edition, which scholars call DTR1, was written to build a narrative arc that culminates in Josiah.
It evaluates every previous king based on the strict criteria of Deuteronomy. Specifically, did they centralize worship in Jerusalem, and did they eradicate idolatry?
And by those criteria, almost every prior king fails. The history is designed to present Josiah as the new David, the king who finally implements the law correctly, centralizes worship, and purifies the cult.
It validates his reign as the climax of Israel's covenant relationship with God, and we see the thorough execution of this reform detailed in chapter 23.
He systematically dismantles the religious infrastructure.
He removes the vessels made for Baal and Asherah. He defiles the high places outside of Jerusalem. Crucially, verse 6 states that he specifically brings out the Asherah from the temple itself and burns it.
Which connects directly to our discussion from a previous deep dive about the presence of the Asherah in the First Temple period.
Right. He is dismantling centuries of localized worship and concentrating all legitimate religious authority within the Jerusalem temple.
The physical actions are very aggressive. He's not just closing down competing shrines, he is desecrating them so they can never be used again.
He burns human bones on the altars to render them permanently unclean according to the law.
Yes. Now, amidst this massive institutional reform, the text introduces Huldah, the prophetess.
Right. When the scroll is found, Josiah needs it authenticated, and he sends his top officials not to Jeremiah, who's presumably active in Jerusalem at this time, or to Zephaniah, but to Huldah.
Huldah's role is critical. The royal establishment seeks out a female prophet to validate a text that will redefine the entire nation's religion.
And she authenticates the scroll, confirming that the words are the word of the Lord.
However, she delivers a severe caveat. She affirms the judgment pronounced in the book upon Judah because of their past idolatry.
But she tells Josiah that because his heart was penitent, he will go to his grave in peace, and his eyes will not see the disaster.
The reform, therefore, delays the end. It does not avert it.
This sets up a profound theological tension. You have a total national reform, led by a king who is described as being unparalleled in his devotion to the law, which is still deemed insufficient to save the kingdom from its eventual fate.
And this tension brings us to the theological rupture at the end of Josiah's life.
Let's talk about that rupture. In chapter 23, verse 29, the narrative takes a sudden, jarring shift. Pharaoh Necho of Egypt marches north.
Because the geopolitical situation had evolved, Egypt was marching to the Euphrates to support the remnants of the Assyrian army against the rising power of Babylon.
Which seems counterintuitive since Assyria was the old enemy.
Well, Egypt preferred a weakened Assyria as a buffer state rather than dealing with a newly dominant Babylonian empire right on its borders.
That makes sense. So Josiah goes out to confront Necho at Megiddo, and the text simply says that when Necho saw him, he killed him. That's it, a single verse. I really need to push back on this because it feels like the text just breaks here. The Deuteronomistic history operates on a strict mechanical principle of retribution. Obedience brings blessing, peace, and long life. Disobedience brings disaster.
That is the core formula.
Josiah is described as a king like no other in his devotion to the law. He did everything right. Yet he is cut down in his prime on a battlefield fighting an Egyptian pharaoh. And the text offers zero theological commentary.
It just states it.
Why does the machinery of retribution suddenly stop? There is no explanation provided for why the righteous king suffers this fate.
Your observation identifies the exact seam in the text. This is where Cross's two-edition model provides significant explanatory power.
How so?
If the first edition, Detour 1, was composed during Josiah's reign, it was written while he was alive, victorious, and reforming the nation. The narrative was meant to end in triumph.
So it couldn't have included his death at Megiddo because it hadn't happened yet.
Exactly. The theology of Detour 1 was built on the assumption that Josiah's righteousness would secure ongoing peace and prosperity.
But when history failed to align with the theology of that first edition, a revision was necessary. Josiah's death broke the theological model they had just built.
Right. The second edition, DTR2, was compiled decades later during the Babylonian exile. The redactors had to absorb the catastrophe of Josiah's death and the subsequent fall of Jerusalem into a narrative that originally pointed toward a golden age.
So the flat, unembellished notice of his death at Megiddo acts as narrative scar tissue.
That is a helpful way to visualize it, yeah.
It's like reading a biography written by an adoring contemporary, where the final chapter is suddenly written by a coroner. The tone shifts entirely.
It is the seam where the optimistic original text and the devastated exilic revision meet. The writers of the second edition simply report the historical fact of his death without attempting to justify it within their theological framework because it defied that framework.
They had to reckon with the reality that righteousness did not guarantee survival.
And following Josiah's death, the geopolitical freefall is rapid. His son, Jehoahaz, reigns for only 3 months before Necho deports him to Egypt.
Necho then installs another of Josiah's sons, Jehoiakim, as an Egyptian vassal.
Judah is immediately reduced back to vassal status, losing all the independence Josiah had secured.
The turning point for the entire region occurs a few years later, right? In 605 BCE at the Battle of Carchemish.
Yes. Babylon, under Nebuchadnezzar, decisively defeats Egypt. Judah transitions from being a vassal of Egypt to a vassal of Babylon.
Jehoiakim pays tribute for a time, but eventually rebels against Babylonian control, assuming Egypt will back him up.
Which is a miscalculation that brings Nebuchadnezzar directly to Jerusalem.
This leads to the first major deportation in 597 BCE. Nebuchadnezzar takes the city. He deports the young king Jehoiachin, who had just succeeded his father, along with the elite members of society, the officials, artisans, and warriors.
Nebuchadnezzar then installs Zedekiah, Josiah's third son, as the new vassal king. And it is essential to note that this specific year, 597 BCE, and the installation of Zedekiah is exactly when the Book of Mormon narrative begins.
It's the very first verse of 1 Nephi.
Exactly.
Now, the narrative of two kings continues to the bitter end. Zedekiah, despite the warnings of prophets like Jeremiah, eventually rebels against Babylon too.
Right. In 587 BCE, Nebuchadnezzar returns, and he does not show leniency a second time.
The result is a brutal 18-month siege. The city falls. Zedekiah tries to flee, but is captured near Jericho. He is brought before Nebuchadnezzar at Riblah.
It's a very gruesome end.
His sons are executed before him, and then he is blinded, ensuring that the death of his children is the last thing he ever sees. He is taken to Babylon in chains.
The temple and the palace are burned to the ground. The bronze pillars of Solomon's temple are dismantled and taken as scrap metal.
The kingdom of Judah ends.
Yet, the Book of 2 Kings does not end with the burning of the city.
Right. In verses 27 through 30 of chapter 25, the text shifts to Babylon, 37 years later.
King Jehoiachin, who was deported in the first wave in 597 BCE, is released from prison by Nebuchadnezzar's successor, Marduk.
He is given a seat of honor among the captive kings in Babylon, a change of clothes, and a regular allowance for the rest of his life.
Scholars are quite split on how to interpret this ending. Gerhard von Rad viewed it as a deliberate note of hope.
He argued that the exilic redactor was signaling that the Davidic line had been preserved, right?
Yes. The seed of the promise was still alive, indicating that God was not entirely finished with the dynasty, even in exile.
Conversely, Martin Noth viewed it as a bleak, factual record.
Right. For Noth, the author was simply concluding the history with the latest known event, There was no theological promise attached, merely the stark reality of an exiled king living on a pension in a foreign land.
Utterly dependent on the empire that destroyed his home. We're going to hold on to that image of the captive king at the table for our closing reflection. For now, we're moving from established historical consensus into a section of interpretive synthesis.
We're going to look closely at Lehi's Jerusalem and how the Book of Mormon aligns with the world of two kings we've just detailed.
You should engage with these ideas seriously while maintaining a careful distinction between archaeological data and interpretive proposals. Let's begin with the most solid ground available: demographics and epigraphy.
Jeffrey Chadwick has done extensive archaeological and demographic work concerning this period.
And he addresses a specific detail in the Book of Mormon. Lehi is explicitly identified as a descendant of Manasseh, a northern tribe, yet he is established as a property owner in Jerusalem, which is the capital of the southern kingdom of Judah.
How does a northern tribal descendant end up with established generational wealth and property in the southern capital?
Chadwick argues that this anomaly is explained by the refugee crisis of 722 BCE. When the northern kingdom fell to Assyria, there was a massive influx of refugees fleeing south into Judah.
Archaeological evidence confirms this demographic shift. Jerusalem expanded dramatically during this specific time. The population surged, and the city boundaries were extended to the western hill to accommodate the influx.
New walls had to be built to enclose these new neighborhoods.
Chadwick proposes that Lehi's family represents the descendants of these northern refugees. Over the course of a century, from 722 BCE down to Lehi's day in 597 BCE, they assimilated into Judean society.
They became established residents, acquiring property and wealth, all while retaining the genealogical memory of their northern Josephite ancestry.
This reading aligns a specific textual detail from the Book of Mormon with the established settlement archaeology of the late 8th and 7th centuries.
Supporting this physical data is the work of Dana Pike, who focuses on epigraphy. Let's clarify epigraphy for a moment. We're talking about the actual physical study of ancient writing, right?
Yes.
The seals, the bulli, which are the clay stamps used to seal documents, and ostraka, which are inscribed potsherds.
Exactly. Pike's research details the naming practices and scribal culture of Jerusalem during the exact time of Jeremiah and Lehi.
The names found on these clay seals from the late 7th century names containing the divine element Yah corroborate the cultural and linguistic environment depicted in the opening of the Book of Mormon.
The material evidence places the nomenclature and scribal habits of Lehi's record firmly in this specific historical window.
From this foundation of demographics and epigraphy, we move into interpretive synthesis, specifically regarding the internal dynamics of Lehi's family.
Neil Rapley has proposed a reading that maps the family conflict, the persistent division between Laman and Lemuel on one side and Lehi and Nephi on the other, onto the theological fault lines created by Josiah's reform.
Rapley suggests that Lehi and Nephi represent an older, pre-reform religious tradition.
Right. Their focus on visionary experiences, the divine counsel, and angelic mediators aligns with practices that the Deuteronomistic reform sought to suppress or centralize away from.
The reform prioritized the written law and the centralized temple apparatus over private, ecstatic, visionary experiences in the desert.
This reframes Laman and Lemuel entirely. They are not just petulant or merely rebellious. They hold a coherent ideological position based on the prevailing religious establishment of their day.
If Laman and Lemuel are aligned with the Deuteronomistic reform, it provides a substantive rationale for their behavior. They value the centralized law and the physical temple.
This explains their insistence, recorded by Nephi, that the inhabitants of Jerusalem were a righteous people.
Because if they believed that Josiah's purification of the temple and the strict adherence to the new law code legitimized the city, then they believed Jerusalem was secure.
Exactly. From their perspective, the reforms fixed the problem. God was in his temple, the law was being kept, and the city was safe.
Therefore, their father's visions of impending destruction and his decision to flee into the wilderness would seem to them like dangerous apostasy and a rejection of the authorized, state-sanctioned religion.
They are defending the establishment theology of 597 BCE.
Adding to this interpretive layer is the work of Daniel Peterson. In his paper, Nephi and his Asherah, Peterson connects Nephi's vision of the tree of life to the specific symbolism of the Asherah that was present in the first temple.
As we noted earlier in chapter 23, Josiah specifically removed and burned the Asherah from the temple.
Peterson argues that Nephi's vision reclaims that suppressed symbol. When Nephi sees the tree and asks for its interpretation, he is shown the Virgin Mother of the Son of God.
The tree is associated with divine motherhood, and the condescension of God.
This brings us to a broader scholarly convergence, notably the work of Margaret Barker. Barker is an independent British Methodist scholar whose research focuses extensively on First Temple theology.
Barker argues that Josiah's reform was not just a purification of foreign idols, but a suppression of an older, native Israelite theology.
She proposes that this older theology, which existed in the temple before Josiah's purge, included the veneration of a heavenly mother, the concept of a divine council, and the presence of angelic mediators.
According to Barker, the Deuteronomistic reformers systematically removed these elements in favor of a strictly monotheistic transcendent God who communicates primarily through the written law rather than through visions or a divine council.
It is important to emphasize that Barker arrived at these conclusions independently, based on her analysis of biblical texts, apocryphal literature, and early Christian writings.
She did not develop her thesis to validate Latter-day Saint theology. She was unaware of the Book of Mormon parallels when she began her work.
Her work represents a minority position within her field, but it provides a detailed reconstruction of a suppressed religious tradition that shares significant, uncoordinated parallels with the theology articulated by Lehi and Nephi.
And Kevin Christensen has done extensive work synthesizing Barker's findings for a Latter-day Saint context.
He highlights how her reconstruction of First Temple theology clarifies the religious environment of the Book of Mormon.
The value of Barker's work in this context is that it provides an independent scholarly framework that accommodates the possibility of a visionary prophet like Lehi operating in direct opposition to the religious establishment of late 7th century Jerusalem.
It grounds the theological conflicts of Lehi's family in the actual historical trauma of Josiah's reforms.
Right. We are now going to shift our tone. We are moving from the rigors of scholarly analysis and historical reconstruction into a warmer pastoral space.
We want to reflect on the theological implications of these texts and what they mean for a faithful Latter-day Saint reader today, drawing on themes familiar to those studying the Come Follow Me curriculum.
We return to chapter 23 and the image of Josiah reading the newly found scroll to the people.
The text records that after reading it, he makes a covenant before the Lord, and all the people stood to the covenant.
It is a physical act of commitment. They took a stance, aligning themselves physically and spiritually with the requirements of the text.
There's a profound warning in the setup to that moment. The Word of God had been lost, but it wasn't lost in a distant field or destroyed by an enemy army. It was lost inside the temple itself.
The ordinances continued, the sacrifices were made, the priesthood institution functioned, but the central text was functionally silent.
Put yourself in that environment. You're attending the temple, you're participating in the rituals, but the core instructional text regarding the covenant has been misplaced in a back room.
This has direct relevance for a modern believer. We live in an era with unprecedented physical access to Scripture.
We have it on our shelves, on our phones, constantly available in multiple formats and translations.
Yet it is entirely possible for the text to remain functionally lost to us if it remains unread, unapplied, and silent in our daily routines.
The physical presence of the book in our homes does not guarantee the presence of the covenant in our lives. We can go through the motions of institutional participation while the text itself gathers dust.
When Josiah finally hears the words, his response provides an anatomy of true reform. It happens in 3 distinct movements.
First, he allows the text to break his heart. He rends his clothes. He doesn't justify his ignorance or defend the status quo. He is cut to the core.
Second, he gathers the community to hear the word together. He recognizes that the covenant is communal, not just individual.
Third, he translates that conviction into action. He executes the difficult political and social work of reform.
And it is notable that the reform was not just liturgical. Jeremiah later notes that Josiah judged the cause of the poor and needy.
The reform was ethical. True adherence to the text resulted in a more just society.
However, as we have established, we must confront the reality that Josiah's righteous actions did not save the physical kingdom.
The reform occurred, the people stood to the covenant, but the destruction still came. Megiddo happened. The siege happened.
This brings us back to the final verses of 2 Kings, the scene of Jehoiachin at the Babylonian table.
If the text ended with a burning of Jerusalem and the blinding of Zedekiah, it would stand as a testament to the futility of human effort. Even the most righteous king, executing the most thorough reform, could not reverse the trajectory of the nation.
It would be a story of complete despair.
But the final note is an act of unearned mercy. The exiled king is brought out of prison, his prison garments are changed, and he is given a seat at the table in the midst of the empire that destroyed his home.
We can read this Christologically. The law, the reform, and human faithfulness were insufficient to prevent the catastrophe. The Deuteronomistic theology of strict retribution reaches a dead end in the ashes of Jerusalem.
But in the midst of failure and exile, grace appears. The shape of the gospel is hidden in this conclusion.
It's a reminder that mercy operates even when the structures we rely on collapse. The table in Babylon foreshadows the communion table, where grace is offered to the captive.
This reframes the assessment that Josiah trusted in the Lord, that trust did not protect him from the swords at Megiddo. His reform did not preserve the temple from Babylonian fire.
Trust, in this biblical sense, is not a guarantee of physical safety or institutional survival.
Trust is finally vindicated beyond the visible wreckage of one's lifetime. Josiah's faithfulness mattered, even if it did not produce the immediate outcome he expected.
Which brings us to the profound wager made by Lehi and his family. They walked out of a doomed city, leaving behind their property, their inheritance, and their social standing.
They wagered that the covenant was portable.
They believed that the God of Israel was not geographically confined to the walls of Jerusalem or the precincts of the temple.
They believed that mercy could cross an ocean.
The record they kept is the documentation of that wager. They carried the brass plates with them, ensuring that the text would not be lost again.
As we conclude this study of 2 Kings, I want to leave you with a final thought to consider on your own. It concerns the ultimate paradox of the Babylonian destruction. By burning the physical temple, the empire forced the surviving exiles to locate their sanctuary entirely within the text. The loss of the physical building is exactly what transformed them into a people of the book, ensuring that the scroll Josiah found would outlast the very stones of the temple it was found in.